Wordle is a game where you try to guess the right 5-letter word in as few tries as possible. For every word you input, correct letters in the correct spot are displayed in green, correct letters in the wrong spot are displayed in yellow, and letters not in the word are displayed in grey. Every day there is a new word to guess, and you can keep track of your results by looking at your guess distribution. It's similar to poker in the sense that anyone can get lucky in the short run and guess the correct word in a single try. But if you want to maintain a good average score over a large number of guesses, then you definitely need a well thought out strategy. As with poker, there are Wordle solvers that tell you what the best guess is in every situation. They do this by calculating the average number of remaining guesses for any given input, assuming best play on future streets. Every input has a certain expected outcome, and if you can always choose the option with the best expected outcome, you've essentially mastered the game. In this example, we got lucky with our first guess. With the middle letters fixed in place, there are only 3 possible words remaining: blast, flash, and flask. At first glance, it looks like it doesn't matter which word we guess next. But the fact is, one of these guesses has a worse expected outcome than the rest. If we go with blast, we have a 1/3 chance to get it right. But the 2/3 of the time that we don't, we have a 50-50 decision between flash and flask. Working out the expected outcome of our decision, we get an average of 2 guesses. If we go with flash or flask, there is also a 1/3 chance of getting it right immediately. But the difference lies in the 2/3 of the time that we don't. Here, the color of the first letter will tell us what the correct word is. If the F is green, the answer is flask. If not, the answer is blast. Working out the expected number of remaining guesses, we get 1.66, which is a significant improvement over starting with blast. Just like in poker, it's possible to get rewarded for making poor decisions. Blast might have the worst expected outcome of all 3 options, but it will still be the correct word 1/3 of the time. It's the poker equivalent of calling it off on the flop without getting the right pot odds. You'll still hit your draw a good chunk of the time, but in the long run, it's the expected outcome of the play that matters, not the result. Notice how in the above example, we were able to work out the best play by hand. With only 3 possible answers, the game tree was quite manageable, such that we were able to compute the expected outcome of each option manually. But the more possible answers there are, the harder it becomes to do this. For example, let's say we open with class and get this configuration of letters instead. What should our next guess be? Just like before, we can list down all the possibilities, but this time with 19 different answers, the game tree is way too big to work things out manually. The best we can do is make our decision based on heuristics or general principles. One possible heuristic might be to choose a word that shares as many letters as possible with the remaining candidates, excluding letters that are already known. Something like print should give us plenty of information to work with since it contains many shared letters, and regardless of what color these letters show up as, we will be able to narrow down our list of words greatly. It might not be the option with the best expected outcome, and chances are it's not, but it's a decent guess that gets the job done. This is essentially how humans play poker. Without the solver, the best we can do is rely on heuristics like bluff hands with equity and size up when villain is capped. These heuristics don't necessarily lead to perfect play, but what they do is allow us to make reasonable decisions in the majority of situations. This is especially important on the turn and river, where most of the spots we face are going to be unfamiliar. There are way too many permutations of turn and river cards, not to mention earlier street actions, for us to be well prepared in every spot. It is therefore crucial that we are prepared for our unpreparedness, and having good heuristics can go a long way towards doing that. For instance, whenever the turn checks through and the river is an undercard, a fairly reliable heuristic is to check raise most of our rivered one pair. Betting would be a mistake since our hand has showdown value, but once we check and face a bet, our hand becomes a pure bluff catcher. Calling, folding, and raising are all close to 0 EV, but what tips the scales in favor of raising is the fact that we have excellent blockers to villains' continuing range. Given the turn action, the only strong hands we are worried about are rivered 2 pairs and sets. 6x blocks a big chunk of these combos, making it an especially profitable hand to bluff raise with. Note that this effect is independent of the runout. Changing the board, we see that rivered 1 pair is still check raising at high frequency because it still blocks most of in position's highest EV continues. This is the main advantage of heuristic based thinking. It allows us to take a pattern that we see in one spot and apply it to other spots that we have never encountered before. You might expect the same approach to work well on the flop, and it does, relatively speaking. With good enough heuristics, it's definitely possible to achieve a high level of play. But if you are serious about the game and putting in significant volume, then you might want to consider the following approach instead. Let's return to our Wordle analogy for a moment. We saw how useful heuristics can be, specifically the heuristic of choosing words with as many shared letters as possible. How would this apply to our first guess? There are approximately 16,000 5-letter words in the English language, so it's going to take a little more time to list them all out and identify the most common letters. And even if we could do that, why would we? There is simply no reason to go with a heuristic that doesn't even guarantee the best option when we have solvers that can tell us the exact expected outcome of any starting word. All we need to do is look at the solver and memorize the best word. Anything beyond that is just overcomplicating things. It's the equivalent of trying to think about preflop in terms of heuristics. Even if you come up with the world's best heuristics, there will always be a simpler and better alternative: to memorize preflop charts. So if you've ever found yourself making statements like, "I should 3-bet with this hand because it's not strong enough to call," then it might be time to rethink your preflop strategy. In short, for partially solved games like poker, rote memorization works best on earlier streets where the number of potential situations we might encounter is small, and we only transition to a more heuristic-based approach on later streets where there are far too many unique situations to memorize them all. The flop is a bit of no man's land where both approaches are viable. But if you're playing poker for a living, then it's definitely worth taking a bit of time to automate your flop strategy in a manner similar to preflop. The Wordle equivalent of the flop would be the second street. We've previously seen that a heuristic-based approach works reasonably well, but one way to improve upon that would simply be to memorize the optimal word for the most common situations. For example, the word that I personally open with is crane, following which there are 142 different color patterns, some of which occur more frequently than others. The most common pattern is the one where we get no matches, and in this case, the guess with the best expected outcome is sloth. If we can commit this to memory, it saves us a ton of effort the 11.4% of the time that we find ourselves in this situation. The next most common pattern is when the A is yellow and the corresponding word is silty. There's no need to memorize the best word for every single pattern, but if we can nail even 5 or 6 of the most common ones, that's already a third of all possible situations where we'll get to play perfectly. It's a huge reward for a very small amount of effort, especially when you consider that the alternative is to rely on heuristics that don't even guarantee the best play. So how should we go about doing something similar for poker? Well, one of the most important components of any flop strategy is bet sizing. If we can memorize the correct bet size for the most common c-betting situations, we can bypass a huge step in the decision-making process. Which is not to say that we never want to be thinking about how ranges interact, but the idea is to do most of the thinking one time off the table. From there, it's just a matter of recognizing the type of board and executing the corresponding strategy. Here's a simple litmus test. What c-bet size would you use on King Jack 6 Rainbow, button open versus big blind call? If you're unable to answer the question immediately, then you definitely have loads more off-table work to do. The more frequently a spot occurs, the more important it is to automate our strategy, and button versus big blind is at the top of the list. It might be okay to wing it for the less common spots like in position cold call, but as the spot increases in frequency, the reward for being well prepared increases along with it. Kind of like how it was important to memorize the best word for this pattern, but not this pattern. One way to develop a sound c-betting strategy would be to run your own solves, aggregate the results, and then use a program like Excel to tabulate the data. It's a time-consuming process that can feel quite daunting, especially if you're not used to working with solvers. In which case, a smarter way to work would simply be to get a GTO Wizard subscription. At the click of a button, you get access to detailed reports for all the common flop situations. Not only does this save you time, you'll probably also be able to interpret the data better thanks to GTO Wizard's powerful visualization tools. Let's use button versus big blind as an example. Here, we have a bird's eye view of button's c-betting strategy across all 1755 strategically unique flops. It's a lot of information contained within a single graphic, but in order to make sense of this information, we need to break it down into more digestible chunks. For example, if we filter for parrot flops only, we see a very clear preference for the 1/3 pot size bet. There are many possible reasons for this. It could be that betting big would isolate ourselves against the large proportion of trips in the big blind's range, or that there are many vulnerable hands in our own range that want to bet for protection, but are not strong enough to bet a bigger size. And while it's obviously not a bad thing to understand these reasons, hopefully by now we can all agree that there has to be some element of memorization as well. Raise preflop, see a pad board, bet 1/3 of the pot. No need to complicate things beyond that. Monotone boards are also quite straightforward. We see the same preference for the 1/3 bet, albeit at a lower frequency. Disconnected boards are a little trickier because there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. Instead, most of the boards fall into two distinct categories: boards where we mostly use the small bet, and boards where we play big bet or check. Zooming in on the ace-high boards, we see a very well-defined line separating the two. If the middle card is 9 and below, we want to use the small size. If the middle card is 10 and above, we only use the overbet. This happens because protection is a lot more important on the first type of board. On ace-9 deuce, for example, a small bet folds out a ton of Broadway hands such as King Jack and Queen Jack, or at the very least puts them in a tough spot. This alone gives us plenty of incentive to bet our 9x hands. On ace-10 deuce by comparison, betting 10x doesn't accomplish quite as much. King Jack and Queen Jack now have a gut shot and are trivial calls versus a small bet. We end up checking most of our 10x hands, which also means that the hands we do bet are that much stronger. Mostly sets, 2 pairs, and strong top pairs that want to go for a bigger size. Eventually, what we end up with is a table like this. Repeat for all the other common formations, and flop play becomes a breeze. Bear in mind that the exact sizes will vary according to rake structure and other parameters, so make sure to do your own table instead of just copying the sizes you see here. GTO Wizard has solutions for plenty of different formats, including ante and straddle games, so you should be able to find something similar to what you're playing. I recommend trying it out for a month. It's a relatively inexpensive way to sort out your flop play, and if you've never done this type of work before, I can guarantee you that it'll be well worth the money. You can also use the link in the description for a 10% discount. Happy studying, and I'll see you in the next video.